Hi, and thank you for joining me, Bruce Hallis, your host on this new podcast series called Rethinking the Human Factor. Today, in episode 1 of series 1, we are going to introduce you to a gentleman by the name of Gregory Michaelidis. Now, Gregory fits the profile of the type of guest that we set out in mind when we first came up with the idea of this new podcast series. He fits that profile because his formal training and the majority of his career to date has been outside of the cybersecurity industry. And it's those external insights that we think we would like to introduce to our community through this podcast series, in the hope that they maybe inspire new thinking around the challenges of awareness, behavior, and culture. Gregory's formal training was in liberal arts, and then after that, he took up his early career pursuing a variety of roles in academia. After academia, he moved into government and policy making, and then under the Obama administration, he got his first real break into cybersecurity as a director of communications strategy at the Department of Homeland Security. So, without any further ado, I think it'd be great if we could crack on with the interview and could introduce you to the man himself, Gregory Michaelidis. Thank you for joining us on the journey. Hi, Greg. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on. This is my first podcast recording as a guest, having recently come out of government. So I'm happy to be here and look forward to it. As you mentioned, I come at the issue of cybersecurity from a somewhat different angle. I recently had spent, 7 years as a communicator in the Obama administration here in the U.S.
Right.
And worked at the Department of Homeland Security over that time, first as the head of speech writing for the Secretary of Homeland Security, and then for the 3 years after that, working in our directorate that handled cybersecurity and also infrastructure protection. So during that time, I had plenty of opportunity to do a lot of writing and messaging and message coordination, and also to get a glimpse of what types of things worked or didn't work. It's often difficult to tell if something really works because in many ways, government and even the private sector has not really built or structured their awareness and education efforts in such a way that it's possible to know if they're working or having a positive effect. But look forward to talking today and sharing a few ideas back and forth about how we can do better as we move into this Internet of Things era, and fortunately an era with a lot of challenges to remaining safe and secure online.
Absolutely. Great. And I've been really looking forward to it now for quite some time from that initial first discussion we had. So you mentioned there your work within the Department of Homeland Security, but it's been a journey to get to that point, hasn't it? And I think what would be really useful for our listeners here is to sort of understand a little bit of the Greg journey that led to the point of working at the Department of Homeland Security in the role of Director of Communications Strategy there.
Sure. I came at it, from the standpoint of somebody who initially was going in a more academic direction as a historian and had a strong interest in security policy. But then as I got a little bit further along in my career, I realized that so much of the energy in security policy, whether it's international affairs or diplomacy or more domestic or homeland security, as we'd call it here, it goes into the policy formulation and then also into the kind of interagency tussles over who will administer it, who will be in charge, who has what authorities. And that when it gets to the point where it will be promulgated or shared or implemented, then there's less attention. And specifically, there's much less attention to the kinds of language that people will use in order to get people on board, whether it's a program where it just calls for general awareness or whether it's an attempt to get people to sign up for something or subscribe or change their behavior in some way or another. And that can apply both internally to employees of government agencies. It could be law enforcement. It could be the general public. Could be a targeted set of individuals, certain age range, perhaps. But I was interested and also somewhat frustrated in government that the latter piece of the puzzle was often neglected relative to how much energy went into the creation of the policy in the first place. And so I found my mind drifting toward ways that we could improve in looking at some of the literature around metaphors and cognitive learning, some of the ways that we could improve the way we reach out to people and ideally get them to be aware and participate, in a set of behaviors or interventions, you might call them, that data and evidence tells us are smart, are wise ways of acting to kind of keep ourselves, our families, our communities, our businesses a little bit more safe and secure and resilient in the face of some of the threats that are growing and sort of morphing out there right now.
Okay. So your earlier career then was really on that policy defining and then getting agreement for the policy at a national level. Am I right there?
Well, that's where I saw a lot of the attention. And I had done a little bit of speech writing. And so when the chance came up to get to work in a security agency, when President Obama was elected, I was excited by the chance to get to draft speeches. And, sounds very interesting and often is, but often gets to be, kind of repetitive after a while, often for very good reasons, in that you need a certain degree of message discipline. So if you're talking about border security or aviation security, you want to have the senior-most officials speaking with a similar set of core points or programs that they're going to talk about. But then even beyond the speech writing piece of it, I realized that oftentimes the speech is not necessarily the tip of the spear, so to speak. The speech may be kind of a lagging indicator of work that you've already done, which is to see how you would approach the issue. Is it exhorting people to take action in the face of some sort of more timely or urgent threat? Or more often, it's trying to get people's level of understanding and awareness up, not just staying back in a sense of fear, so neither overreacting nor underreacting. And so that's really the aspect of policy implementation and what the role is for communication that got me interested in the work that I'm doing now, having left government and doing a little bit of consulting on my own, and then also some convening and writing through the cybersecurity initiative at New America, the think tank that's here in Washington, D.C.
Right. So the initial piece then was, you were involved in, had an interest in how policy is developed. And then you are sort of alluding to the fact that there's a lot of energy that goes into this. And in a sense of once the policy's been developed, then the job's done. But actually, it's just the beginning of the journey, isn't it? Because then the next point you're alluding to was, okay, so then it was all about how do you actually embed that policy? And the idea being that the policy is there to influence behaviors of people in a positive way. And, obviously there are some concerns about government influencing the general public. But, I think the issue is the objective is to try and get those behaviors to happen off the back of the awareness, but that actually not that much energy is being put into the bit that really makes a difference. It's almost like a wheel without a tire, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And so to go back to the Department of Homeland Security example, in 2009, we were developing language and kind of trying to show what the focus of the new administration would be. It was the first time that a different political party had taken over this young department. And so early on, we realized that we wanted to get more forceful about talking about the bottom-up nature of security awareness, if you will. So not just the kind of more top-down border control, border security, aviation security, but also at the community level, among faith groups or ethnic groups, within communities. There were steps that we wanted people to take that would prepare them when something went badly, whether it was a natural disaster, whether it was a terrorist attack, or increasingly a cyber attack or data breach. And so there were really three kind of main programs across DHS. One, the READY campaign at ready.gov, which had to do primarily with preparing for and being ready for natural disasters, so hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, those kinds of things. And then a campaign which DHS initiated and then kind of brought back into the fold, which is still in effect, called If You See Something, Say Something, which It's a little bit broader and more amorphous, but alluded to kind of a situational awareness for people and reporting things that were amiss or that seemed out of place. And then the third program, which also still exists, was a cybersecurity awareness program called Stop, Think, Connect. And so it was interesting that we had these three programs which covered somewhat separate areas, but all of them shared the idea that these were things, common sense things that people could keep in mind at the right time in the right place so that they would be able to act on them. However, as you said, the car that's missing the wheel, the programs were treated very differently in terms of the way that information and data and evidence were used in the creation of them. And then the part that really interested me the most was seeing how data and evidence was either used or not used in terms of the dissemination of the messages and whether people were getting on board, so to speak, or whether there was a baseline level of awareness that we were improving. And that's really where I think we have a lot of progress yet to make, especially in cybersecurity.
Okay, no, that's what's really interesting. I mean, the thing that springs to my mind is, why would you have one approach for embedding policy, or developing a campaign around situational awareness, the READY campaign around how to respond to natural disasters, or a campaign around situational awareness in terms of being aware of the environment you're in and identifying something that looks suspicious and then, highlighting that to the relevant law agency. And then cybersecurity. If you're doing it for the others, why not do it for cybersecurity?
It's a very good question, Bruce. And I would take your point even further. So those were the three large buckets of awareness programs at DHS, but there additionally are programs for kind of a subset on the cyber front that is more aimed at online security in terms of keeping young people away from, potential predators or online, criminals.
Yeah.
Perhaps being groomed for that type of activity. There's in the UK, the effort in the Prevent program, which was in some ways copied in the United States around countering violent extremism. And there was also a program that was aimed more at professionals that was training people or raising awareness about how to spot signs of human trafficking, especially among transportation professionals working in commuter rail and, bus transport and that kind of thing. And what I found frustrating was that these well-meaning programs and often, smartly done programs were created out of a specific need or a specific gap, but there would always be additional programs created without anybody stepping back to say, is having a separate program with a separate budget and, being operated out of a different office or a different directorate the best way to kind of carve up the pie of what we want people to know and be aware of? And that proved much more difficult because I don't recall a time when, communicators stepped back and said, presumably the American public or, any public has only so much capacity for ingesting new information and understanding complicated threats. And we want to make sure we're not either giving them no useful information or, as more often the case, loading them up with lots of information. How should we slice that up and approach that in the most effective way? And there has never really been an attempt to do that. And that's only speaking for the one large department, because within the U.S. government, there are other programs from other agencies that cover similar terrain and similar ground, whether it's the FBI or DOJ or the Commerce Department. So it's, I think part of it has to do with the immaturity of that field, but it is ironic that within cybersecurity that such a theoretically data-driven and evidence-based discipline seems to kind of drop the ball when it comes to holding up that same standard on the communication side of things.
Yeah, I think you sort of allude to a couple of really interesting points there. It's, for me, you've got, the overall objective of all those different campaigns is ultimately be aware, behave accordingly, And, you could then imagine you scale that up, you start to get something which is part of just the day-to-day way of living, and that becomes embedded in the culture, you could argue. And you've got some areas where we're trying to implement a policy, in this case at a national level, where we're using this more data-driven metrics approach, which recognizes the gap between awareness and actual behavior. And then you get other areas where that isn't being used. And it's interesting because it's all about achieving the same outcomes in many ways in terms of awareness, behavior, and culture. And it's the inconsistent approach. And, I do sometimes wonder whether or not, there are lessons there within organizations where, chief security officers, chief information security officers, whoever's accountable for information security, cybersecurity, whether, they come across similar type of challenges themselves. The other thing, I guess, thinking through what you've just been covering there is, you're talking about the issue of the maturity of thought within the cybersecurity area. It's almost like the security field firewall. There's a firewall that surrounds the industry. And I just wonder whether or not there is any, in your experience, any reluctance to engage with people outside of that industry to come in and to provide their, some insight based upon their expertise and knowledge. And I just wonder whether or not you experience that at all.
I think that is very much the case. And I've been thinking and writing a little bit about this lately, so may have, more to share with people soon. I think there are some myths or, perceptual kind of falsehoods at work within what has become a very large kind of corporate-driven, entity. Cybersecurity was a fairly small field, maybe in the neighborhood of about $3 or $4 billion a year worldwide. Only, not too long ago, maybe 2004, I think, and is now, on pace to be something on order of like $175 billion this coming year. So it's grown dramatically, and it's grown in the direction of the many vendors and the many sort of highly technical products and services that are aimed towards enterprise users or towards corporate users or government or military. But I think that during that time, that a kind of myth has taken hold that there isn't much of a role for individuals, that as individuals, we're more consumers, and consumers need a little bit of consumer protection to make sure that, they're not defrauded, but that our real role is to stick with the technology industry and eventually to be more of a recipient of secure devices and apps and downloads and, smartphones and that kind of thing. And that troubles me greatly, because I think that historically, that it's very difficult to just sort of hand over to people kind of a security in any given realm. They're, ideally in a society where the technology should be working for us and, putting it to the uses, that we choose, that there should be a role for individuals beyond simply, kind of waiting for the next iteration to come out and hoping that it has fewer security gaps. And so I think that message that there will be a role for people, and that role might involve things like, a more skeptical view of high-tech companies producing a lot of products that are poorly coded and have a lot of security gaps in them, is one way to kind of change the marketplace a little bit, in that it will show that the general public is interested in security and is, perhaps willing to pay a little bit more, at least to pay a little bit more attention, but that they're not simply users kind of held off to one side. And that's why I think that myth is kind of carried over into efforts, to get people more aware and to practice safer behaviors, because if they're simply meant to just, wait until version 3.0 or 3.12 comes out in whatever product it might be, then you wouldn't take as much of a public health approach to the communication and the uptake of these kinds of programs. But if you see people as essential partners, I guess, or as potential partners, not only in their own security, but also in kind of a herd immunity of security within their community or on whatever networks that they're on, that you then treat people by helping at an earlier age build in some of the awareness and some of the skills that you'll want to have as they get old enough to have their own devices and their own accounts, and then, a little bit down the line become, employees or business owners themselves, or parents, or leaders in some other capacity.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I find that interesting, that getting the message right, raising awareness effectively, bringing about changes in behaviors of, younger generations in particular. I just think it's a fascinating subject because it addresses so many of the shortcomings that we currently face when it comes to information security, lack of skills in the market, employing people who have inconsistent approaches to security. It would be great if there was some sort of baseline that everybody was trained to. And I've seen some work being done by different countries where they clearly have a vision around that, with the idea of making sure that primary schools or secondary schools, up to university, that children are being equipped with the skills they're going to need, so they recognize that they have a role to play in not just the security of themselves or their families or the schools, but when they go into employment, the organizations they work for. And then ultimately you're talking about the countries that they reside within. And then, more, I guess, even on a larger scale, you've got, global economic and social prosperity is associated with these things. So the thing, interesting, when we had a chat, one of the things you mentioned about was in your role as a communicator of policy, you had some experiences you felt that might be worth sharing about. And I just thought, I remember when you mentioned it and you said, well, I could share some of the lessons that I've learned, where things could have been done maybe differently.
Sure.
Whether or not you would be, you'd be happy sharing those with the listeners.
Sure, I would be happy. And I think that, having a sense of humility about this, what I think is essentially both an art and a science of communicating for effect and outcomes, that having a sense of humility about it is a good thing, that communicators, we can get much better at doing what we want to do if we are willing to subject ourselves to not only, some self-scrutiny, but also the scrutiny of other practitioners. If, a particularly well-meaning program is going to be promoted through, a series of radio spots or a celebrity, or that sort of thing, and after months and months, a lot of money is spent and nothing has really been achieved, then saying, okay, this may not have been the proper, method of getting this vital information into people's hands. How could we do better? I think that would be seen as a real sign of success. It's kind of interesting if you look at the length of many of the TED Talks and other similar kinds of kinetic speaking, that oftentimes there's maybe a 6 to 9 minute range. But if the goal is to reach the widest number of people with information that could have an impact on their health or their security or their safety, we need to be willing to get much punchier and shorter because of people's attention spans.
Yep.
I've heard people joke saying, despite the progress we've made as humans, we still have this kind of reptilian brain and set of responses like fight or flight, and a capacity to be overloaded with information and to then start to either just tune things out or to make poor judgments. And I think we need to be respectful of that in everything from website design to the length of the copy that we use. I was going back trying to think of speeches that broke through or stuck with people in certain ways. And Lincoln's Gettysburg Address kind of captured my attention because the entire speech is only about 275 words long. So, roughly the length of a short bio or a blog post maybe, but yet contained so much power and timeliness in it in a way that today is almost unfathomable, or perhaps more fathomable because it was so short. But oftentimes, policymakers and politicians and whatnot are giving very kind of lengthy dispositions on things. And that certainly has its place if you're testifying before Congress, if you're, doing a dissertation defense. But in terms of reaching people with necessary information, I think we need to be willing to be humble, to test our assumptions, to be short and tight and effective, and then to loop back around and see what's working and correct course if it's not.
Yeah. So off what you're just saying there, a couple of comments, and maybe you could, come back on these. How, when you think that a lot of organizations, when it comes to sort of cybersecurity, education and awareness, tend to take the less mature approaches, so they tend to have a one-off event in the year. So maybe the exercise is a 1 hour exercise when you sit down in front of some CBT, you receive messages which arguably will be less in length than the Gettysburg Address. But, all the messages together might come to an hour. How does what you're just saying there about, in effect, how physiologically we have not developed to cope with the amount of information, and that our attention span has shown evidence of shrinking, maybe in some areas more than others. So how does that conflict with how we currently go about trying to raise awareness about cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I thoroughly agree. I've heard from people who are experts on the more technical side of cybersecurity and information security about the need to get away from what they call sort of a checklist mentality, or an annual check, towards a much more real-time ability to see what kind of threats are out there. And in a way, that checklist mentality has its analog in the way that we run these programs. There's a number of other programs that are not part of U.S. government that are funded by other foundations. There's been analyses of these by some different folks about why they aren't more effective. But what many of them have in common is that they continue to add on additional tips. And if you follow any of these campaigns on Twitter or go to the website, it's kind of an agglomeration of tips. So the presumption there is there doesn't need to be any kind of underlying set of values or principles or behaviors upon which all those tips are made, that people have to somehow be able to keep up with the changes to the technology and the threats. And that's where I think, in a way, that we need to get back to the kind of first principles and look to some of the ways that, say, we educate young people about health and safety, for instance, or then eventually driver's safety and driver's education. You start with some very basic principles that my 4-year-old daughter can recite now about safety, or about washing your hands before eating, about stopping at the stop sign, those kinds of things. I think that in order for us to be able to process or assimilate the tips that will be responsive to the changing technologies, that we first have to have those kind of more bedrock principles built in. And right now, many of the programs, many of the implementation strategies are, in essence, they're commercial. They're sort of extensions of the efforts of many of the companies that create the insecure technology. So in the case of Department of Homeland Security, they offer sort of baseline funding for the Stop, Think, Connect program, but then have a whole bunch of technology partners who I think legitimately want to help do something about issues related to online safety. But they are in a position, because of their business models, where it's going to make it very difficult for them to step back and to think from the perspective of what young people ought to know, and to develop a sense of skepticism about some of the products and some of the messages that they hear, because they're very alluring. But the nature of a civil and a civic society is that we develop the skills to be able to kind of navigate through a commercial universe of different products and services in such a way that, with the help from teachers or family members or, whomever might be faith leaders, that you kind of build up the guardrails in the sense of common sense about how to navigate those waters. And I think we're not doing a very good job, if at all, with young people, at least here in the United States. I know you mentioned other countries. I've heard that New Zealand, I think, might be one that is taking that a little bit more to heart. But
Yeah.
I think you put your finger on a really big challenge there, Bruce.
I think it's interesting there, listening to you, that you're talking about all this, that checkbox, that you make people aware of specific threats. So you can imagine an organization's done its risk assessment, has come up with a list of potential, threats, and it's done that at a given point of time. And then the awareness campaign might be to reflect upon what those threats are and to educate people so they're situationally aware that this threat exists and this is how you might experience it and this is how you might respond to that. But it's an interesting point you make, which is that underlying all those individual type of threats, it's the principles and the values of information security, cyber security, because by actually understanding those enables you, when you experience something which is maybe an unknown threat, or it's unknown, but it hasn't been integrated into the awareness and education process and program within an organization. So it's like, yes, it's happening this year, but we've only just become aware of this sort of thing. So we're now going to put that into our program for next year. And obviously then there's a window, there's a window of opportunity there where people are in the dark, so to speak. And that's the thing I can see in the value of what you're saying about the underlying principles. If you can get the underlying principles and people are confident with those principles, then it enables them to fill the gaps ideally consistently when those gaps appear. That seems to me to be a really good thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. We know that you can't stop all risk, but that you can equip people to perceive it a little bit better and be able to bounce back when inevitably something bad happens.
Yeah. There was something that we mentioned a little bit earlier where we were talking about audiences and getting the message right for an audience. When you look back on the days of preparing speeches on policy, did you take an audience-led approach to communicating with people? Or did you take the approach of, we're going to document the speech or the communication, whatever form it is, and then we're going to push it out and we're going to sort of, in a way, see what sticks? I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, the approach of one size fits all for communicating and the effectiveness of that compared to sitting back before you even start to write and thinking, okay, who is our audience? What's the best way to communicate to them? And what is the way that they want to be communicated with? I'm trying to get a sense of what experience you've had of that and which side of the fence you would prefer to fall upon if you were in a position of responsibility in terms of raising awareness about cyber.
Yeah, my feeling is that speeches are probably increasingly becoming a poor way of targeting or, very kind of useful information, that they're in some ways sort of a blunt instrument that is one way kind of pushed out, from the podium, and they're, swayed very much by the individual speaking style, their own strengths or weaknesses, their own love for certain phrases or certain approaches. And that's not to say that they can't be very persuasive or effective. But I think that increasingly, if you look at the much more granular means of communication, so I think it was probably 8 or 9 years ago during the 2008 campaign when a number of people working in kind of behavioral work were introducing A/B testing on messages for President Obama's campaign, techniques which are, now very common in terms of testing web content and copy, or approaches to fundraising or to, advocacy, that they started seeing very dramatic differences between just subtle changes in a couple different words. So I don't think there's much thought given to that in the vast majority of speeches, which I think are kind of, serving a fairly day-to-day purpose of honoring somebody or something, or, getting across support for a particular policy. But that a lot of the interesting stuff is happening, within social media and within some of the ways through metrics and A/B testing that we can see what is more effective and then go and test, try it for a period of time and see what we're getting back. And that's where I hope that we can set something of an example, and that people will realize that then including one frame versus another, or one particular metaphor versus another, and in the more public kind of broadcast speeches, that there can be a difference in effectiveness.
Okay. Just for the listeners, when you refer to the phrase A/B testing, what does that actually mean?
So there's some different variations on it, but in the political sense, campaigns would try out two or more different variations on getting, requesting people to donate or to get involved. And if it's web-based or social media-based, that they would be able to essentially do a random controlled test where 50,000 people would see one and 50,000 people might see the other, and then you'd be able to see the response rates on it and try to make some generalizations from that about the language. And so, it's difficult in some ways for governments to do that, certainly because of laws about privacy and collection of information and, sharing different information with different people without telling them. Mm-hmm. So large government agencies are probably not going to be the leaders on that, but there are other ways within the research community and within cybersecurity community to, work with people in varying different fields in political psychology and behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, and even in food security. I was just thinking the other day how many similarities there are between some of the strengths and weaknesses of, say, global food distribution and nutrition and cybersecurity. And so when we have more of those people who aren't from the traditional computer science or engineering background who are contributing to the conversation, I think it'll be a sign of health that we're getting beyond what is now, it just feels to me to be kind of a heavily industry or fee-for-service, fee-for-product driven model that is in need of a real shakeup.
Yeah. What I think it was interesting, just before that last answer, you were sort of talking about the strengths and merits of actual speeches themselves. And you can write a good speech, just as you can write a great policy, and you can hand it over to the person who's going to present that speech or the person that's going to present that policy. And then suddenly you're sort of alluding to the fact that it could be the skills of the presenter that actually affects the likelihood of bringing around the behaviours that you're anticipating. Is that a reflection of what you said earlier?
I think so, yeah. I think obviously there are speakers who are very engaging and can, deliver remarks either with moral fervor or with a sense of humor or, whatever is required at the moment. But I think that the majority of public remarks are fairly forgettable. They probably go on too long, and there aren't necessarily good ways of tracking their success. But I think that in one sense, the core messages in a public presentation or in a speech need to flow from an evidence base for it if it's a public policy direction that we're asking people. But then that delivered speech needs to be put together with that advice, and ideally you'd have consistency across all your platforms, and you'd have other people echoing, other senior leaders echoing it in their public remarks. It would be reflected in your printed or your collateral materials and your social media strategies, and you'd start to hear almost a feedback loop where, listeners will start to talk about it almost as if it's their own. Yeah. Which is really kind of the goal, is for it to become kind of widely held.
Okay. So the personal brand of the speaker, what the audience perceives them as, is going to have an impact upon the outcome of the speech, even if the speech content, makes absolute rational sense, and if it was based upon evidence as well. Do you think that that's right? That, that brand is going to really affect the output?
I think very much. I know there have been studies showing that people react as much or more to the visual and the body language and the tone and the cadence of remarks or communication as they do to the content of them. So to a great extent, I think they can be helped or hurt but also there's certain kind of intangible qualities. Our DHS for the previous 7 years, the head of FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Association, was a fellow named Craig Fugate. And I didn't work for Craig, but I have a lot of respect for him, and he's widely respected in his field. But he was also just an exceptionally nimble and comfortable speaker who knew just intuitively how to relate to people. So, for instance, he would often talk about one measure of quickly bouncing back from storms and hurricanes was what he called the Waffle House test, meaning that those types of restaurants, breakfast places and 24-hour, Waffle Houses could either keep going or get their doors back open again quickly, as kind of a metaphor for, people being able to meet their basic needs, get a hot meal, keep functioning, have a place to meet up with others if there was a storm or a natural crisis. And that, isn't something that a speechwriter or even research, I think, would necessarily tease out. It was why I often point to it as sort of an art and a science, because he had used that metaphor and had been there on the ground during many incidents and saw that as a kind of an apt metaphor for how quickly and effectively you can respond to public events. So it's in some ways kind of difficult to predict or to program in that sense. It's almost like in some ways you know it when you hear it, which is, I guess can be frustrating because it makes it very subjective if that's the case.
Yeah.
So I think ideally then what that tells me is that you would subject, your communicators and your messages to more scrutiny and to get a sense of who your best and most effective communicators are and what information you want them to get across.
And in your experience, are some people really good at communicating verbally, but maybe not so effective at communicating in terms of a written form? And I guess what I'm trying to get to here is I was involved in a discussion with a head of information security, and I had to ask the question. I said, there are these people called copywriters, okay, and they make a living. And my suspicion is that they make a living because they produce something which is of value. And what they're doing is they're writing message effectively for audiences. Now, how well are you writing messages for audiences? I mean, I know that I'm not particularly great at writing. My thing is, I guess, talking. But, it's that sense of, some people are better at doing different types of communication. And you need to recognize that if your overall objective is I've got this policy based upon evidence, I've got to get to these audiences. We understand that there are maybe 1, 2, 3 ways that we want to get that message out there, that actually the person that writes the content or the person that's part of that exercise, these might be different people.
Yeah, it's an apt point. I think you hope that you'll get a response back from somebody who may, if they're not a great communicator, will be willing to say so and take, help and assistance. I think inevitably, however, in government and in institutions, you'll find individuals who maybe perceive that they're really strong at something and just can't imagine that's not the case, or that there's something that they're missing. And everybody kind of becomes a communication expert in those scenarios. And it's that I've been in them before. It's not pleasant, and I don't have a great answer about how to get out of that.
No, I think you deal with each case on its own merits, but it's something that I've heard, a reluctance to sometimes admit that that's not my strength. And at that point, you're okay, where can I find somebody with that right strength? Okay. You mentioned the phrase evidence-based policy making, which then supports speech writing. And evidence sort of brings to mind, I guess, to me, the sense of it's being rigorously assessed or researched with a methodology which has been agreed in advance, and that generates data. And that, from the data, if you apply rational thinking to that data, that there is only one outcome. And I think that's interesting, because do people respond rationally to any form of communication we give to them, especially if it's based upon figures? You know, it's the argument of rational versus irrational. Have you got any thoughts on that? Because you had mentioned it's evidence-based, which would suggest rational, you know, this belief that people are going to be rational.
Yeah, I think that in reality, that there would be kind of a series of stages or interlocutors, if you will. So, you know, taking it out of the security realm for a moment, think of a prominent cardiologist giving an important speech at a major conference and calling into question something that's been, you know, common, and, you know, saying we should be doing, you know, cardiac care this way instead of this way, and here is the result of the largest study to date about it. You know, that would go through, you know, stages of kind of filtering, if you will. You'd have trade press, you'd have, you know, highly competent medical correspondents and journalists who would package that finding and help kind of interpret that finding for then what might be the story that would appear in the New York Times, which then itself may trigger reporting by local media and be shared and kind of distilled. And ideally, you would have, you know, the information at the end stage that's coming through people's own televisions, or, you know, a short radio or a link that they'll see on their news feed, still bear close resemblance to what the advice would be. Unfortunately, we know that a lot of science reporting, a lot of medical reporting, and I think often perceptions about risk and perceptions of fear of terrorism and issues related to climate change and those kinds of things do not get well transmitted at that public level. That, you know, at least in the United States, there is a very large gap between what experts think are the most risky and likely scenarios that individuals will encounter and what people's own perceptions are. And that's a very difficult problem to solve. It's interesting that in the realm of, say, science journalism, and especially climate science journalism, there's strong academic projects now looking at how to communicate and communicate effectively. And it would be interesting to see, you know, sort of a security journalism or security communications project or program, you know, either within think tanks or at the academic level, begin to take that challenge seriously, you know, just as we need to make sure we're understanding the nuances of what we're learning about, you know, climate change, that we need to understand sort of risk perception and make sure that the local news is not making it seem as if something highly unlikely to ever happen to an individual is in fact something you should be, you know, really terrified about, when in fact there's a whole host of other types of concerns. And in, you know, I think that 8 or 10 years ago, there was a sense that perhaps social media and the internet would improve upon that problem and mitigate some of it. I think instead that it's actually gone in the other direction of people in their own, you know, kind of filter bubbles, as the book put it a couple of years back. And it's a really pretty difficult problem to solve. And
So I mean,
wish I had.
You had the answer.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
I think the point there, which is reassuring, is that, you know, this isn't a challenge which is just unique to cybersecurity. The whole argument of policy, making people aware, with the intention that that brings around the behaviour to address the evidence base, which says that this appears to be good and this appears to be less so good. So I think it's reassuring to know that outside the security world, this is a challenge for everybody. And I think more importantly, that this has been a challenge for everybody for a lot longer. You know, the whole concept of cybersecurity is a relatively new one. I think information security goes way back beyond cybersecurity, you know, to the spoken word, you could argue. So it's reassuring to know that there are a lot of people that have been looking at this for a long time. And the point you allude to is there is stuff that we can be learning from them. And that's partly why with this series of podcasts, the whole idea is about interviewing people who come from outside of the security domain, who have these insights and are maybe applying it ideally within the security domain, which is obviously one of the things that you've set out to do. Okay, I know that I've had plenty of your time. I didn't know if there's any other thoughts that you wanted to share with our listeners about what, in your mind, makes effective communication based upon your experience at all.
I am curious about convening, and then interested in convening people from other disciplines altogether who, understand how to make things stick. And so I welcome feedback, and I'm sure you would, from listeners who, can point to, like you work in, Bruce, other analogies or metaphors for other fields where they've tackled some of these problems before, and that we can, introduce some of these fresh views, kind of help ventilate the technology-driven kind of echo chamber around cybersecurity.
Yeah. So it's been great having you here. It's been great listening to your thoughts on the challenges that we face within the industry around the issue of, communicating to raise awareness, but really importantly, to raise awareness to bring about good, positive security behaviors out there, whether it be, from youngsters at the beginning of that learning curve through to us who are, a little bit more mature, who are still facing real changes in the environment around us day in, day out. And what used to be common sense becomes maybe a little less common sense as things change so very, very rapidly. So thanks very much for your time. I've really enjoyed it. I am sure that our listeners have enjoyed it. I'm currently looking at my book. I have 6 pages of notes. So that will send me away and keep me busy for another couple of hours after this interview.
Well, I'm glad. I'm happy to be invited to join, and I look forward to people's questions and follow up to keep this conversation going. So thank you very much for being a great host.
Thanks very much, Greg. And best of luck with the snow outside the front door.
Thank you. It looks rather pretty out here. We finally got a little bit of snow in Washington to finish off winter.
Okay. Well, enjoy. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Bruce. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye. Well, I hope you found that chat with Gregory of interest. I know that I did. It's an interesting reflection that I made 6 pages of notes after spending 5.5 years of doing research into the human factor. And maybe this illustrates one of the big opportunities, or maybe challenges, however your perspective, that we face. And that is the need to develop a evidence-based pool of knowledge which enables security professionals to make better informed decisions about how we deliver awareness, behavior and culture within our own organizations. But from all of those 6 pages, I've chosen 3 particular points I thought might be of interest to you. The first one really was the imbalance between investment in terms of times and resources into the development of policies, processes and procedures, compared to the resources made available in education and awareness. One look at maybe a budget for a year might actually illustrate, the difference between the two. The second point that I would pick up from what Gregory had to say was the power of the personal brand. He alluded to the fact you can write a great speech, but at the end of the day, the person delivering the speech is going to have a significant impact upon, the tone of voice of the speech, how well it's delivered, whether the audience actually feel any relationship with that individual. And, it does ask the questions, some people talk about the security brand, but how many of us are really thinking about the personal brand of the people who are communicating information security across our organizations? The third thing that I would look to pick out was how Gregory picked up on the phrase of communicating for effect and outcome. And for me, this is quite clearly drawing a line between the communicating to say that you have made people aware and communicating or raising awareness with the intention of influencing behavior. And in my experience and in the research that we've done at Marmalade Box, it's sort of suggestive of the fact that not many organizations are really thinking about behavior as part of the strategy and how they develop their communication plans and techniques. And that, without considering that, you pretty much end up with communicating for communicating science and being able to tick the box, and not communicating for effect and outcome, as Gregory alluded to. The final point that Gregory will have picked up for us is his concern about how there's a trend of seeing security as not being something that we are service providers or to third parties that you might be doing business with. And this is a deeply cultural issue. And I think it's quite interesting that, in my experience and the research that we've done, cultural attitudes towards confidentiality and security, integrity, availability, these type of things, they differ significantly around the world. And it's really important if you're looking at developing an awareness campaign to drive good security behaviors that you take into consideration those cultures. So if you found that interview with Greg of interest, if you find the issues of awareness, behavior and culture of interest, then please do continue to stick with us on that journey. Our next podcast is going to involve two guests who have combined comic and illustration to educate children in particular upon the issues of cybersecurity. If you want to find out more about who they are, if you want to find out more about what they do and what they think about awareness, behavior and culture, then please do join us on our next podcast. And if you want to know when that podcast is going to be out, best way for you to stay in contact with what's going on here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast is to sign up to the RSS feed, join the Marmalade Box LinkedIn group, follow us upon Twitter at Marmalade Box, or alternatively, go to the Marmalade Box website, sign up to the newsletter, get the full hash of all the blogs, articles, and podcasts that have been released in the previous month. And that way you can stay in contact with us. I really do hope you continue to stick with us on the journey. And if you found this of interest, please do let your colleagues within your networks know about all the work that we're up to here and what we're trying to do. Thank you very much. Look forward to joining with you soon.